Hello, Peter47890/Cyrus here, and welcome to my supplementary review of both Fire Emblem Fates Birthright and Revelations. Now, this is mostly just a follow-up to my review of Fire Emblem Conquest, and I would really recommend watching that review first to get the full picture. And there's going to be annotations for that video that should appear right about now. The reason for this video is that I think a supplementary review would probably suit talking about Birthright and Revelations more than a full review, since the core gameplay mechanics and overall presentation in the three version of Fates are still more or less the same, that it would be redundant to make a full review on each individual games. But I still think that the difference between Conquest, Birthright, and Revelations are still substantial enough to warrant a video of their own in terms of talking about the story, characters, level design, balance, etc. So let's start out this video by talking about Fire Emblem Fates Birthright. Fire Emblem Fates Birthright is basically the version of the game where you fight on the side of Hoshido, with the entire structure of the game being really reminiscent of Fire Emblem Awakening, with you having the option to grind optional various scouting missions that you can do in the game. But before we talk about the gameplay of Birthright, let's briefly talk about what I think of the story. The story of Fire Emblem Fates Birthright is basically the typical Fire Emblem plot, with the main character Corrin basically lending his or her strength to the defense of Hoshido from Nor. The plot, suffice to say, is very safe. It's basically a tale of a defending nation fighting against its aggressors that we all have seen. But Birthright does the plot well enough, and there's not really much wrong with the writing and Birthright overall, besides maybe playing it a bit too safe to the point that it might be boring to some. The cast of characters that is playable in Birthright can also feel this way. Now, I don't think they're boring, and I do like most of the characters' personality and the antics that they can come up with, as well as the chemistry they have with each other in the support conversations. But I'll be lying if I say I like them more than the Nor cast, since I do think that the Nor cast got much more colorful and varied cast of characters under the wings that I really enjoyed, while the cast in Birthright, while very likable, feels very typical mostly, though there are some exceptions. And I'd probably say that playing it safe is the best way to describe Birthright's gameplay. One such factor that contributes to that is that out of all the three games, it's probably the easiest one. Now, with that said, I don't think it's as much of a pushover that people say it is, though Ryoma does break the game balance somewhat, but it can probably be the most forgiving and safe versions of Fates. One such factor that contributes to this is that enemies barely have any skills to worry about, unlike in Conquest. The other is due to the fact that you can grind, as well as how easy it is to earn tons of money when playing through Birthright, even if you don't do any of the optional maps. But the other factor that makes Birthright the most forgiving is probably its map and level design. The map and level design, while well designed, I'd probably say is pretty straightforward, which does make it easy to strategize around. Now, there is some thought put into these maps with you having to use strategy, unlike in Awakening where it can feel like Zerg Rush sometimes. But Birthright level design can feel pretty straightforward, or, lack of another word, safe. This is especially so when you're comparing to Conquest and Revelation, where the maps in those versions of Fates, you can really see the creativity in the map and level design and the challenge that comes from that creativity. Now, despite saying that Fire Emblem Fates Birthright feels safe and straightforward in its design, maybe a bit too safe, Birthright still feels like it's its own game within the series, with the numerous mechanical changes that Fire Emblem Fates bring in general, such as the change to the weapon triangle system, the revamped weapon system, the revamped pairing up system, new classes, etc., which overall still makes it a really fun game to play. And the fact that the game is designed so safe does make it ideal for newcomers to start out with this game without feeling overwhelmed. Now let's talk about Fire Emblem Fates Revelations. Fire Emblem Fates Revelation is basically the route where Corrin is unable to side with either Nor or Hoshido, with Corrin's goal is basically to find a way to bring peace to both nations, with this route having a much more focus behind the mysterious force that manipulates both Nor and Hoshido to war. with Korn directly opposing this mysterious force by uniting both Nora and Hoshido. Now, Fire Emblem Fates Revelation is basically a game where they not only answer some question that was left unanswered in both Birthright and Conquest, but the game overall structure is supposed to strike a balance between Birthright and Conquest, which it succeeds in some regards. It has the open-endedness of Birthright structure, with you being able to play optional maps and grind, as well as have most of the characters in both Birthright and Conquest, which does make the Revelation route to have the largest cast of the 3 games. But the level design of each map is also not as straightforward as Birthright, with there being some really creative levels in Revelations. That really does make the individual maps in Revelations to be much more engaging and interesting to go through than Birthright. Albeit the level and map design in Revelations isn't as well designed as Conquest, but they are still interesting, even if they might be tedious at times. Even if there are some levels that seem like it had good ideas, but the actual execution of those maps were rather shoddy, such as the snow level, or the level where you have to wait for a platform to come and basically move your units to another part of the map, which can make it feel pretty tedious as you play through the levels. But I do think there are more hit than misses with the unique maps that are introduced in Revelations, but the misses can be rather large misses for some people. And overall, I think the strongest appeal in Revelations to me is the creative and flawed level design. Having most of the characters both Birthright and Conquest is a joy, seeing with the unique interactions and chemistry that they have with each other. The amount of content that Revelation really has is also appealing, with all the different characters you can level up, how you can make certain builds for certain characters, building support chains, etc., with there being a lot of endgame potential for players to sink their teeth in. And let's not forget that the core gameplay mechanics is still a blast to experience. The story though I found to be passable. The things you find out are a bit interesting, but I wouldn't really say it grit being all that much. I still liked it for its characters, but I think the actual plot itself wasn't all that interesting. With that said, I do think Revelations has a few major flaws. The first, and probably the most important flaw, is its unit balance. I'll just give it to you straight. Fire Emblem Fates Revelations has pretty atrocious unit balance. Most of the units that you can recruit in Fire Emblem Fates Revelations are going to be so underleveled compared to your core team probably, that it makes it really tough to use various units in a no grind run. And not to mention that the actual unit availability in some of the maps can be pretty unbalanced as well, and iffy. The other problem is the reused maps in Fire Emblem Fates Revelations. There are quite a few reused maps from both Conquest and Birthright in Revelations, which can make its Revelations to feel rushed. And even worse, some of the maps that they do reuse from the other games are basically shadows of the former self, since the actual enemy placement and how these maps are played from the original games are basically butchered in the worst case scenario in this game, such as comparing Conquest Chapter 10 defense maps. That map in Conquest was just a brilliant defense map, with how enemy units was placed, the type of enemies that appear in there, how siege weapons was reintroduced, and they even added new type of siege weapons in Fire Emblem Fates. The enemy terrain, how it was an actual defense map, and etc. All those factors just made it so much fun to play through Chapter 10 of Conquest, even if it was infuriating. Then you compare it to its Revelation incarnation, and their Revelation incarnation feels so gutted in comparison. In fact, most of the maps that they reuse from Conquest feels this way. The maps they use from Birthright, not so much. The only exception to this rule, about how most of the maps from Conquest feel gutted, is probably Revelation incarnation of Chapter 15, well, Conquest Chapter 15, where you have the replicate mechanic, which I think Revelation actually did a better job with, since you have a good amount of units to experiment the replicate mechanic with, which really did make it fun. But even with those flaws, I still like Revelations. It was really fun to go through, and while the story wasn't all that interesting, I thought the ending was really satisfying, especially having finished playing through both Conquest and Birthright. Anyway, that's my overall thoughts of Fire Emblem Fates Birthright and Revelations. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and know that despite there being some problems with Fire Emblem Fates, I still had a lot of fun, either if it was on Conquest, Birthright, Revelations. It was just so much fun. I mean, I spent 200 hours on Fire Emblem Fates, going through all 3 versions of the game, and I don't really feel all that burned out. I do feel a bit burned out, but that's mostly because of having spent like 200 hours on all the games, rather than being sick of its mechanics or gameplay overall.